The cold evening breeze swept through the hospital entrance as people hurried in and out, lost in their own worlds. No one paid much attention to the golden retriever sitting near the glass doors, its fur slightly dirty, its body still as a statue. The dog had been there for days, watching, waiting. Every time the doors slid open, it perked up, its eyes scanning every face that stepped out. But each time, the hope in its eyes faded, and it lowered its head again, curling its tail around its paws as if bracing itself against disappointment. Some of the hospital staff had started noticing the dog's presence. A young nurse named Emily had seen it the night before and felt a pang of sadness. It hadn't moved much, just sat there waiting. In the morning it was still there. By afternoon it hadn't left its spot. Someone from the cafeteria had placed a small bowl of food near it, but the dog barely touched it, only nibbling a little before returning to its silent vigil. It wasn't just lost. It wasn't just a stray. It was waiting for someone. A security guard named Daniel had been watching it too. Every evening when his shift ended, he saw the dog in the same place, staring at the hospital doors like it was expecting someone to walk out any moment. The sight of it sitting there, unwavering, made him uneasy. He had seen dogs abandoned before, but there was something different about this one. It wasn't wandering around looking for food. It wasn't scared or aggressive. It was just waiting. That night, as the sky darkened, the wind grew stronger, and rain began to drizzle. The dog didn't move. It tucked its head under its body, shivering slightly but never leaving its spot. Daniel sighed, pulling his jacket tighter around himself as he watched the animal. Something about this dog was unsettling. It had no collar, no signs of ownership, yet it behaved like it belonged to someone. Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that there was a story behind this dog, something no one had figured out yet. He made a decision. Tomorrow morning, he was going to follow it. If no one else was going to find out why it was there, he would. Because no dog waits like that, unless it has a reason. The next morning, Daniel arrived earlier than usual. The air was crisp, and the city was just beginning to wake up. As expected, the dog was still there, curled up in the same spot near the hospital entrance. Its eyes were open, scanning the faces of everyone who walked past. It looked tired, as if it hadn't truly rested in days. But it remained where it was, refusing to give up. Daniel stood nearby, watching closely. A few hospital workers came out and greeted the dog with soft voices, placing another bowl of food beside it. It sniffed the food, took a few hesitant bites, but quickly turned its attention back to the doors. It was clear now, this wasn't just any stray. This dog was waiting for someone specific. Curiosity gnawed at Daniel. He had seen dogs that followed their owners around town, but he had never seen one so devoted, so still in its silent patience. He walked over and crouched down beside the dog. "Who are you waiting for, buddy?" he murmured. The dog flicked its ears but didn't look at him. Its gaze remained locked on the hospital entrance. A woman in a blue coat carrying a coffee cup stopped beside Daniel. "It's been here for days," she said softly. "I work in the pharmacy. It just sits here watching the doors like it's waiting for someone to come out." Daniel nodded. "Have you seen anyone with it before?" The woman shook her head. "Not that I know of, but the way it waits, it looks like it belongs to someone, like it's expecting them to walk out any second." The thought unsettled Daniel. He glanced at the hospital building, wondering if the answer was somewhere inside. He stood up, brushing the dirt off his pants. "I'm going to find out," he muttered. He headed toward the hospital doors, glancing back one last time. The dog hadn't moved. It sat, perfectly still, eyes locked on the entrance, as if willing someone to appear. Something told Daniel that whoever the dog was waiting for wasn't coming back. But he needed to know the truth, and he had a feeling that once he found out, it would be something he wouldn't be able to forget. Inside the hospital, Daniel approached the front desk. He wasn't sure where to start, but he knew he had to ask. The receptionist, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, looked up as he stepped closer. "Hey," he said, keeping his voice low. "I know this might sound strange, but there's a dog outside. It's been sitting by the entrance for days, waiting. I think it's looking for someone. Do you know if any patient here had a dog?" The receptionist frowned, then sighed. "That dog?" she muttered. glancing toward the glass doors where the golden retriever still sat. "You're not the first person to ask. Some of the nurses have been talking about it too." Daniel nodded. "So, do you know who it belongs to?" She hesitated, flipping through some papers on her desk before finally shaking her head. "I don't, but—" She lowered her voice. "I think you should talk to one of the nurses. Emily, on the second floor. She's been keeping an eye on it. She might know more." Daniel thanked her and headed for the elevators. Something about this felt heavier than he expected. This wasn't just a lost dog wandering the streets. There was a story here, and he had a feeling it wasn't going to be a happy one. On the second floor, he found Emily near the nurse's station. She was young, probably in her late 20s, with kind eyes and a warm demeanor. When Daniel mentioned the dog, she sighed. "I was wondering when someone would ask about that," she said, setting down a patient's chart. "His name is Max." Daniel's heart skipped a beat. "So he does belong to someone?" Emily nodded. "Yeah. His owner was a man named Robert. He was brought in about a week ago. Came in alone, really sick. He was in bad shape." Daniel felt a sinking feeling in his stomach. He already knew what she was going to say next. "He didn't make it," Emily said softly. "He passed away 2 days ago." Daniel glanced toward the window where the hospital entrance was visible below. Max was still there, waiting. He had no idea that the person he was waiting for was never coming back. Emily's voice was quiet. He was the only family that dog had, and now Max is still waiting for him to come back. Daniel stood there staring at Emily, his mind struggling to process what she had just told him. He had suspected something tragic, but hearing it confirmed made his chest feel tight. He turned toward the window again, watching Max sitting at the entrance, unmoving, still waiting. The weight of it all pressed down on him. The poor dog didn't know. He was still holding on to hope, still expecting his owner to walk out of those hospital doors like nothing had changed. Emily sighed and leaned against the counter. "He was in here for a few days before he passed. The staff was kind to him, but he didn't talk much. He was weak. The only thing he did mention more than once was his dog. Kept saying, 'Max is waiting for me. He doesn't like to be alone.'" She shook her head. "We didn't think much of it at the time. A lot of patients say things like that when they're scared, you know? But then, after he passed, we saw the dog outside and realized he really had been waiting." Daniel felt his throat tighten as he imagined it. Robert, knowing his time was running out, worrying about Max. Maybe he thought he'd get another chance to walk through those doors and see his best friend one last time. But life hadn't given him that chance. And now Max, unaware of the truth, was still keeping his promise, still waiting. Daniel took a deep breath and turned back to Emily. "Has anyone tried to take him home?" She nodded. "A few people, some of the staff, even a couple of patients who've been coming in regularly. But he won't leave. If someone tries to take him away, he fights to get back here. He won't eat much. He barely rests. It's like this place is the only thing he knows now." Daniel clenched his jaw, staring at the floor. He had always known dogs were loyal, but this was something different. This wasn't just love. This was devotion in its purest form. Emily's voice was quiet when she spoke again. "The hardest part is, what do we do now? He can't stay there forever. But how do you make a dog understand that the person they're waiting for is never coming back?" Daniel had no answer. He only knew one thing. Max deserved to know, even if it broke his heart. Daniel left the hospital with a heavy heart. As he stepped outside, the cold air hit him. But Max remained where he was, his golden fur damp from the mist settling over the city. His eyes, filled with quiet hope, stayed locked on the doors as if Robert might walk out at any moment. It was painful to watch. Max wasn't just a dog sitting outside a hospital. He was a soul waiting for someone who would never return. Daniel crouched beside him, his voice gentle. "Hey, buddy. I know you're waiting. But—" He hesitated, the words catching in his throat. How could he explain death to a creature who only knew love and loyalty? He reached out, letting his fingers brush through Max's fur. The dog didn't pull away, but he didn't react much either. He was too focused on the hospital doors, too lost in his own quiet grief. Emily and a few other staff members came outside, standing a short distance away. They had been talking about this moment, about what they could do, but none of them knew how to approach it. We were thinking, Emily said softly, maybe, maybe we could bring him inside, let him see Robert's room. Maybe then he'll understand. Daniel wasn't sure if it would work, but looking at Max, he knew they had to try. The dog had spent days outside in the cold, refusing to move, refusing to accept that his world had changed. Maybe seeing that Robert was no longer there would give him the closure he needed. It took some effort to coax Max inside. He was hesitant, his paws dragging as if he knew something wasn't right. The moment they entered the hospital, he sniffed the air, his ears twitching, searching for a familiar scent. The nurses led him to the room where Robert had stayed, now empty except for a neatly made bed and the faint scent of antiseptic. Max hesitated at the doorway. He stepped forward, his nose twitching, his body tense. Then slowly, he walked to the side of the bed, sniffed the sheets, and sat down. His tail stopped wagging. He let out a low whimper, resting his head on the edge of the bed. The silence in the room was heavy. No one spoke. Max had finally understood. Max didn't move for a long time. His head remained on the bed, his breathing slow and heavy. The room was silent except for the occasional sniffle from one of the nurses. Daniel swallowed hard, feeling a lump in his throat. It was as if all the hope Max had carried for days had drained out of him in that single moment. He had been waiting, believing that Robert would return, but now he knew the truth. Robert was gone. Emily knelt beside Max, gently running her fingers through his fur. "I'm so sorry, buddy," she whispered. The dog didn't react. His body was still, his eyes half closed. It was heartbreaking to see, but at least now, Max wasn't stuck in limbo, waiting for something that would never come. After a while, Daniel sighed and looked at Emily. "What happens now?" She hesitated. "I don't know. He can't stay here forever, but I don't think he has anywhere else to go." One of the other nurses, an older woman named Claire, stepped forward. "A few of us have talked about taking him in, but he doesn't want to leave." She glanced at Max, sadness in her eyes. Maybe he just needs time. Daniel exhaled slowly, then reached out and gently scratched behind Max's ears. "I'll take him," he said finally. "At least for now. I'll give him time to grieve, but he shouldn't be alone." Emily looked at him, surprised. "Are you sure?" Daniel nodded. "I don't know if he'll want to come with me, but I can't just walk away. Robert wouldn't have wanted that." They gave Max a few more minutes in the room, then slowly led him out of the hospital. He walked hesitantly, glancing back once at the bed before following Daniel. When they stepped outside, the cold air hit them again, but something felt different. Max paused at the entrance, looking at the hospital doors one last time. He stood there, unmoving, as if saying goodbye in his own way. Then, finally, he turned toward Daniel, took a slow step forward and let out a small sigh. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Daniel took Max home that evening. The dog moved slowly, his body weighed down by exhaustion and sorrow. He didn't resist, but he didn't seem eager either. It was as if he was simply going through the motions, lost in the unfamiliar reality of a world without Robert. Daniel understood. He didn't expect Max to warm up immediately, but at least he wasn't alone anymore. At first, Max barely ate. He would sit by the front door staring at it the same way he had stared at the hospital entrance, waiting, hoping. Daniel let him be, giving him space but staying close enough to let him know he wasn't alone. He left a blanket near the fireplace, a warm spot in the house where Max could rest. The first few nights, the dog refused to sleep there, instead curling up near the door. But on the fourth night, Daniel woke up to find Max lying on the blanket, his breathing soft, his body finally at ease. Days passed, and little by little, Max began to change. He started eating more, walking a little faster on their evening strolls. He still had moments where he would stop, looking back as if expecting Robert to call his name, but he didn't linger as long as before. He was learning, slowly, to live again. The hospital staff kept in touch, asking about Max, relieved to know he was adjusting. One day, Daniel took him back to the hospital, not to wait, but to visit. The nurses who had cared for Robert greeted him warmly, petting him, scratching his ears. Max wagged his tail just a little. It wasn't the same, but it was something. He was no longer just a dog waiting for someone to return. He was a dog who had been loved and who was learning to love again. As time passed, Max became part of Daniel's life. He would sit by the window instead of the door, watching the world go by without sadness. He had found a new home, a new routine, and though a part of him would always miss Robert, he wasn't waiting anymore. He was living. Max's story is a reminder of the deep love and loyalty that animals give us. If you've ever been touched by a pet's devotion, consider giving that love back. There are countless dogs like Max waiting for a second chance, waiting for someone to care. Visit your local animal shelter, adopt if you can, or simply share this story to remind others that love, no matter how lost it seems, always finds a way home.